Hi, everybody. Thank you again for being with us today in our digital transformation dialogues. I have the honor to have Sonia Jorge with me here today. Besides being a dear friend, a mentor, and a hero in the space, she's the executive director of the Alliance for Affordable Internet. She's an expert in the confluence of development and communications policy with over 25 years of experience in various countries. She has worked in over 40 countries, and her career is spanning both in private and nonprofit sectors. She's an expert consultant, has expert consultant. Sonia led numerous digital development projects in several countries and international organizations, including the World Bank, UNDP, UN Women, and for private sector companies, from mobile operator to industry associations. So Sonia, it's such a pleasure to have you with us today. Thank you.
It's a pleasure to be here with you, Carolina.
Okay, good. So this dialogue is really trying to capture experts as yourself takes on digital transformation, especially in times of crisis. So I'm just gonna go ahead and jump straight to our questions today. So do you think that every organization needs to be digitally transformed to stay competitive or even survive? And how COVID has affected this phenomenon?
Mm-hmm. That's a really good question. I mean, I think especially if you had asked me that question last year, I may have had a slightly different take, right? Even though, as you know, I'm a true believer in digital equality and inclusion and in the power of digital access. I would say that the answer to that question is that it depends on the kind of organization. It depends on the purpose of the organization and what they are using digital technology and digital tools for. So I would say that in a way, it would be great to have every single organization, business, institution with a level of digitalization that basically allows them to be able to be the best they can be for the mission that they have. And whatever that best, whatever technology can do to best support their missions, that would be the right level of digitalization. So that level may be different if you're talking about a grassroots organization in, say, a rural area in Nigeria versus a company working at the core of digital service provision. However, I would say too that for example, I love when I work with the Rural Women Doctors Association in Nigeria, which is a rural organization that greatly depends on incredible digital tools and the power of digitalization to be the best doctors they can be for women in rural areas. So you can have these really wide, almost kind of polar opposites, or appears to be polar opposites of different kinds of organizations. But what's important is that whatever they have and what is made available to them is what supports their mission, what supports their delivery of service, what supports the fact that they are working to increase social justice, to increase the ability and the availability of products and services that are going to really improve people's lives. So I would say it depends on what is digitalization actually doing to support them, what is the role of digitalization in their missions and in their objectives. Now, with COVID, the tricky thing is that it's also a very unusual situation. We don't expect, and God forbid, we certainly don't want to live in a pandemic for the rest of our lives. So obviously, what COVID and the pandemic have shown is that if the world was better prepared with digital tools to address many of the challenges that the pandemic has brought to us, we could have done a lot better. We could have responded better to our constituencies, to customers, to advocates, etc., as service providers, right? Depending on who you were talking about. But that is the exception, right? So what I would say is that COVID definitely highlighted and amplified the importance of digital tools, the importance of digitalization, the importance of being prepared and having the knowledge to use those tools to the best of our capabilities, but it also, I think it has also sharpened, in my view, my belief that, you know, we always have to be prepared. We have to do the best that we can do to achieve our goals and be prepared for surprises, for uncertainty. Now, should everyone, every organization be digitally prepared, digitally transformed? Yes, but again, to answer your question with a final point, as long as that supports their mission, not in a way that it will be an imposition. Technology is meant to be a support and a tool for good, a tool to support improve development opportunities and digital opportunities, but not a tool to either suppress or create more inequalities or to create more questions and tension and stress in what unfortunately is already a world where we live with lots of different stresses and uncertainties.
Definitely. No, thank you so much for that. I think it's very interesting to associate technology as a means to an end and not as the end itself, right? As you are describing. And I think related to that, and you touched that, right? If we don't consider a means to an end, you create new risks, right? You create risks of inclusion, risks of lack of diversity, and even a potentially new form of digital divide, right? You see with students, some being able to do online learning and some not. So they are even being left behind. So my question to you regarding to this is, how can digital transformation be leveraged, especially now during COVID, to rebuild a more inclusive, diverse, and equitable economy at workplaces, communities? And in your experience, because you work a lot with database policy, what are the critical policies at this juncture to support digital transformation for good?
Mm-hmm. So first of all, there's a couple of things. I mean, your question early on alludes to the idea that is a big concern to me, which is technology supporting exclusion. You know, it's not just about using technology for inclusion, for more equitable societies. It's also to ensure that technology is not a means to increase exclusion, right? Or to further extend exclusion in society and economies and in cultures because of the way the ability of people to have access, to adopt, to use is different because of all sorts of different kinds of structural issues and social elements that define ourselves as humans, as people in societies. So technology has so much potential, to be really a tool for good. But to me, the way I like to think about it is that and it's related to your first question, we need to think about, first and foremost, technology as a public good, and especially when we think about access to the internet, right? And when I say access, is not just the ability of potentially have access, but the actual act and agency to utilize, to produce, to create, to benefit, to have access to information, etc. So that ability to act on one's agency, to determine how one wants to use technology, is really important. And when we can do that, and the more we can support people, no matter where they are, who they are, what gender they are, if they are rural or urban, live in a mountain area or in the flatlands, what have you. The ability to have that agency, to me, is core to anything that comes to, or any thinking that we have to do with policymakers, ourselves as leaders of organizations, etc. And what that leads me to say as well is that we need to always keep in mind the purpose. What is the purpose of technology for good? When we talk about that concept, we by default are assuming that technology is good. And those of us who are believers in technology will say, sure, it's something that is important. It brings huge opportunities in many different ways, to advocates, to activists, to governments to be able to provide public services in a better way, to reach the masses, etc. Now, we have to think about that purpose whenever we think about those policies. We have to think about that purpose whenever we think about ways to getting there. And the reason why that's important, Carolina, and I always, and I like to always use a couple of examples, not necessarily project examples, but examples of how life works. When we think about technology for good, to me is, unless the purpose is to make technology available equally to everybody, we will fail, okay? Technology has to always be for everyone at the same level playing field, for everyone, for all, regardless of where they are, etc. Not just for the few. Anything that we do when it comes to digitalization, the opportunity of digital technology, access to the internet, excuse me, and anything to do with digital development, it can never be for the few. Whenever something, an action, a policy, a regulation, anything has in mind just a limited number of people, a limited number of humans, let's call it, if you think about humanity, by itself it will fail. It will fail the concept of, to me, that I believe that technology for good really represents, which is technology for a better world, technology for a more equal world, technology as a tool that will support opportunities, but also the agency of everyone to be able to act on what they determine their lives to be. The other thing that is related to that is the concept of profit, right? And what drives development, what drives digitalization, what drives different, incentives, motivations in the wider ecosystem of the digital development and digital space. And I think here I want to say, and I want to be a little bit provocative, is that in society nowadays, we still haven't found a balance between, very profit-oriented goals around or behind digitalization and the kind of public good goals that should be inspiring the process of digitalization. And I think that when we find that balance and make people at the center, or put people and humans at the center of digital development, then we will get to a place where technology for good and digital for good will make sense. Exactly. Until that point, we're always going to have an imbalance.
And about this imbalance, thank you so much for that. And I couldn't agree more with this, right? So, and I think a very important concept that you worked on and you guys at the Alliance for Affordable Internet have coined, which it's very important, is the meaningful connectivity, right? So what does that mean to exactly allow for this level playing field that you mentioned, right? Something that makes sense for all. But to arrive there, we need a strong, hopefully, right? We need strong leadership, even if that leadership is at the community level, right? The efforts don't need to be all top down. They can also be bottom up. So what is that type of leadership we need to ensure this people-centric, this people first, and this technology for good digital transformation?
So a couple of things that you asked there. One around meaningful connectivity and how that actually, in fact, is a reflection of this idea that we are discussing, but also what does it mean in terms of leadership? I mean, for me, leadership is about purpose and about guidance and mentorship and support. A leader is not a leader if it does not pay attention to everyone around them and to those especially that you want to try to make an impact and affect in a positive way their lives for the better, right? So leaders need to work and really focus on a purpose. And to me, if you connect these then with the idea of meaningful connectivity, and I think that comes with a lot of leadership of the Alliance as well, and how we position ourselves in our space, is that we very much believe that in order to create a better world with this concept of, digital development being a way to provide opportunity, right? Opportunities for better livelihoods, et cetera, we need to start by making sure that everyone has an equal opportunity. And that equal opportunity when it comes to access, affordable access, use, etc., has to do with having the same means to get there. So what meaningful connectivity as a concept, as we develop, does is that it establishes a framework where everybody needs and should and has the right to start from the same minimum threshold. And that minimum threshold has to be the same for everybody. And if it's not the same for everybody, that's not good enough. Something that I very much do not like, and in fact I feel that it's a failure of leadership, is when I hear those who call themselves leaders accept an idea where we can shortchange people either because of where they live or because of who they are, or what gender they have, etc. To me, that's a failure of leadership, not seeing those possibilities and not seeing that by acting without creating equal or equality and equity inspired frameworks, that you're actually producing more exclusion. So to me, anyone who participates in a process that creates exclusion cannot be called a leader. A leader needs to have a purpose. And the purpose is one that is very much inspired by, I would say, I mean, I would go as far as saying, because that's what it is for me, it's about social justice. It's about actions, being policy actions, being project design actions, being in your own communities, taking actions that have a purpose and that are always to increase these opportunity that otherwise people wouldn't have. And meaningful connectivity, even though it's kind of a technical term, as I like to call it, it does that, right? It provides that opportunity. So, and that's why for us it's very important. For example, if you take one of the elements, one of the 4 elements of meaningful connectivity here in our discussion, which is speeds equivalent to 4G, right? 4G is a proxy for good enough quality of connections and also data. To me, everybody has to have that. Otherwise, as COVID has shown, even if you have some access, if kids cannot be home with the right device and the right speed and data, some kids are not going to be able to participate in the digital platform that they are being called upon for education purposes when others will be. So we need to equalize that base, and the baseline has to be one that is grounded on equity and is one that is a stepping stone. But the important thing is that it has to be the same for everybody.
Agree. That's wonderful. I love a lot this idea. You didn't use this word exactly, but that's also how I hear is a leader for the collective, right? A leader for the purpose of the collective, to really make sure this threshold works for minimally for everybody, right? I think that's extremely important. And moving forward a little bit to some of the policy initiatives you lead in the ICT area for so many years, especially because you guys really do a lot of data-based policy recommendations, which for me is crucial, right? So what is the role of data in crafting and implementing this tech policy or defining this threshold you mentioned, right? And how can those support the achievements of the Sustainable Development Goals, right? So many of the WSIS action lines, which are all technology lines, are supportive of the SDGs. So I know there are a couple of different questions there, but is the role of data in policy making to have a good threshold, basic threshold, and then how this relates to the SDGs?
Mm-hmm. So a couple of things. Policy is designed in many different ways, right? The right way to design policy and develop what will become impactful policy is by making sure that policy is based on evidence, okay? And when we think about data, we think of evidence. So we don't just think about data just because its data is going to be good. As we know, it's not the case. It's about evidence that we can trust, evidence that is based on experience. And in many cases, and in fact, in most cases, probably, lived experiences, right? Which means the realities of people's lives within different contexts, okay? So if you think about that, and you think about anything from universal access policy to infrastructure sharing regulations, or a government's policy plans or strategies to achieve the SDGs, they need to come up with a plan and a framework within their own contexts that makes sense to support that path of achieving the SDGs, but one also that is based on evidence. It makes absolutely no sense for a country, for example, to say that they're going to simply have a universal access policy that doesn't have any targets, or that the targets are going to be just about connecting 100% of the population in 5 years, when we know from the evidence that that's almost impossible. So the data and evidence have a couple of purposes. One, to understand where are we, what is the baseline, what are the potential paths that we can take to get to our targets, and our targets should be more realistic than normal in the world, otherwise we're constantly failing to achieve targets. So they need to be very realistic, and they need to be informed by those experiences, right? So I always see data and evidence, Carolina, as ways to inform our thinking so that the policies and programs and projects that are defined also have a higher probability of success, okay? So data is about improving, it's about influencing and informing the possibility of success and increasing that probability of success, okay? Now, if you think about today's data, for one, is lacking tremendously. It's very limited in many respects. Think about the digital gender gaps that exist in the world that are increasing. And even though we know from those few cases that are increasing that we need more data, countries and organizations, private sector, continue to not collect data that is critical to understand or to inform what kind of actions we can take to close the digital gender gap. Right? So without the evidence, we cannot really do much. We can use our guesses, we can use our convictions, but there's not a whole lot of support. And so the data has to be better. The data cannot be limited to questions that are not a reflection of true society, as the gender gaps and gender inequalities and other kinds of inequalities across different groups and marginalized groups and different regions of the world show. But primarily, it needs to be complete and informative. It needs to help provide the evidence. Data is a tool to inform good thinking. It's not the thinking itself, okay? And I think that's really important. And this is why for policymakers, when we work on such things as, for example, as I just mentioned, the universal access policy, I challenge our policymaker colleagues to think about what exactly are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to have a plan that is politically sellable, or are you trying to have a plan that is going to have realistic targets and you're going to do your very best to get to that target? And that target can never be neutral, because societies are not neutral, right? From a gender perspective, from a rural versus urban perspective, etc. They need to be very precise. So when you think about policy, you use the data that you have, or the lack of data that you have, to then request more, but you use the evidence of the other experiences, good practices from other of your peers, to show that your targets cannot just be about these average numbers for the whole. They are neutral, but they have to be specific. For example, having gender targets, or having specific targets for rural development, having specific targets around SMEs, for example, and when you think about SMEs, also having specific targets for SMEs that think about women's ownership and the types of enterprises that are more equal in their frames versus other enterprises that actually function as a way to continue to replicate inequalities in society. So you put all of these things together, and data can be very powerful to help you make the case, because in reality, politicians, policymakers, organizations need hard data to support their decisions. So we at A4AI, at the Alliance, and widely with my colleagues at the Web Foundation, we take data very seriously, but we also take quality data very seriously. and the evidence that we can develop with what that data show us, so that we can inform better policy. When we don't have access to that data, we need to support the creation of it. We need to support the development of it, the collection, the measurement, etc. And that's also another important task that often, unfortunately, is not,
gets
not enough
overlooked.
attention.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Definitely. Yes, one of the I think one of the hardest data besides gender issues and things like that I see a lot is the lack of data on accessibility and disability issues,
Yes.
right? You have this whole population that could be contributing so much for competitiveness, especially now through this almost forced digital transformation with COVID, and we don't know everything that's happening there, right? But anyway, so I think this is great, Sonia. Thank you so much. Do you have any final thoughts for us? And then I think we are done.
No, I would say thank you for having me. And I hope that your community, your partners, and all of those interested in your analysis pay attention to some of these things, so that we collectively can do better and really make a better contribution to a more equal world, and a world where people not only have affordable, but have meaningful access, meaningful connectivity, so that they have more opportunities. That's what drives me in my work on a daily basis. And I hope that it will inspire many more people, so that we can have a very different outlook, I would say, 10 years from now than we have today.
Thank you. That was wonderful and very inspiring. So thank you so much, Sonia, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.